November 18, 1985. Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, London, 7:42 p.m. The royal box stood empty, and that was impossible. In the 250-year history of the Royal Opera House, the monarch's private viewing box had never remained vacant when Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II was in attendance. The plush red velvet seats, arranged in a semicircle facing the stage, were always filled with carefully vetted guests, dignitaries whose presence had been approved weeks in advance through layers of palace protocol and security clearance. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, one seat remained conspicuously empty, positioned directly beside the Queen's own chair. The burgundy velvet cushion sat untouched, a gold-tasseled program placed carefully on its surface, waiting for someone who hadn't yet arrived. In the rows below, London's elite craned their necks upward, whispering behind gloved hands in expensive programs. Who was important enough to arrive after the Queen? Who would dare break the most fundamental rule of royal etiquette? The Lord Chamberlain, Sir John Johnston, stood rigid in the corridor behind the royal box, checking his pocket watch every 30 seconds. His face had gone pale, and a thin sheen of perspiration was visible on his forehead, despite the cool November evening. The security detail assigned to the Opera House that night exchanged worried glances. Something had gone wrong. Someone had failed to appear on time, and heads would roll for this breach of protocol. In the orchestra pit, the conductor held his baton frozen in midair, waiting for the signal to begin. The musicians sat with instruments ready, but nobody moved. You don't start a royal gala performance until the Queen indicates she's ready, and the Queen was clearly waiting for someone. What nobody in that theater understood, what even the Lord Chamberlain had only learned that afternoon, was that this wasn't a mistake. This empty seat, this breach of centuries-old protocol, had been personally requested by Her Majesty herself. She was waiting for someone who existed so far outside the traditional boundaries of royal society that his invitation had caused genuine confusion among palace staff. She was waiting for Freddie Mercury. The story of how the Queen of England and the King of Rock came to share that private box on that November evening began 6 months earlier, on July 13, 1985, when Queen Elizabeth II had done something completely out of character. She had watched a rock concert on television. Live Aid, the massive dual-venue benefit concert broadcast globally from Wembley Stadium and Philadelphia's JFK Stadium, had been impossible to avoid. Even the palace, with its careful curation of what Her Majesty watched and attended, couldn't ignore an event that had captured the attention of nearly 2 billion people worldwide. The Queen's private secretary had suggested she might watch a few minutes, just to understand what the younger generation was so excited about. What happened instead was that Queen Elizabeth II sat through Queen's entire 20-minute performance, then asked for the tape to be rewound so she could watch it again. Her husband, Prince Philip, had been bewildered. Her daughter, Princess Anne, had been quietly amused. But the Queen herself had been genuinely moved by something she saw in Freddie Mercury's performance that went beyond the theatrical costumes and the screaming crowds. She saw artistry. She saw a man who understood how to command an audience with the same authority and presence that she herself had cultivated over 33 years of public service. She saw someone who could hold 72,000 people in absolute silence with a single gesture, then bring them to their feet with a single note. That kind of power, that kind of presence, wasn't learned from rock and roll. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that the Queen recognized from her own training in public performance. But more than the showmanship, Queen Elizabeth had noticed Freddie's voice. Stripped of the electric guitars and pounding drums, isolated in the moments when he sang a cappella sections that the audience echoed back to him, his voice revealed something extraordinary. This wasn't just a pop singer. This was a trained vocalist with the kind of technical control and emotional range that belonged in opera houses, not stadiums. The Queen had grown up surrounded by the greatest classical musicians of the 20th century. She had attended hundreds of opera performances at Covent Garden, had met Pavarotti and Sutherland and Domingo. She understood vocal artistry at the highest level. And watching Freddie Mercury command that Wembley stage, she recognized something that the rock and roll world had perhaps taken for granted. This man was one of the finest natural singers Britain had produced in a generation. 3 weeks after Live Aid, during her irregular weekly audience with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the Queen had made an unusual request. She asked if Mrs. Thatcher knew anything about Freddie Mercury's background. The Prime Minister, caught off guard by the question, had provided what information she knew. Born Farrokh Bulsara in Zanzibar, educated partially in India, immigrated to England as a teenager, built a music career from nothing. An immigrant success story, Mrs. Thatcher had said with approval. The kind of person who proves that Britain rewards talent and hard work, regardless of where you come from. The Queen had listened carefully, then made a decision that would scandalize her more traditional advisors. She wanted to meet Freddie Mercury, not at a formal state function where photographers would record every moment, but privately, in a setting where she could understand who he really was beyond the stage persona. The invitation to the Royal Opera House Gala had been crafted carefully. It arrived at Freddie's Garden Lodge home in Kensington in a cream envelope bearing the Windsor seal, delivered by hand on a Tuesday morning in early November. Freddie's assistant Jim Hutton had signed for it, thinking it was some kind of official tax document or legal notice. When Freddie opened it and read the contents, he had stood completely still for nearly a full minute, reading and rereading the elegant script. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II requests the pleasure of your company at a private gala performance of Puccini's Turandot at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, on November 18, 1985. She attendance is requested in the Royal Box. Black tie. 7:30 p.m. arrival. Below the formal text, in what appeared to be handwriting added later, was a single line. The Queen has expressed particular interest in discussing the art of vocal performance with you following the performance. Freddie's bandmates had reacted with characteristic skepticism when he told them. Brian May had assumed it was an elaborate prank. Roger Taylor had laughed and said the Queen probably wanted to tell Freddie to turn down the volume at his Kensington parties. But when Freddie showed them the official palace seal in the handwritten postscript, they had fallen silent, recognizing that something genuinely extraordinary was happening. The 2 weeks leading up to November 18th had been stressful for Freddie in ways that stadium tours had never been. He had performed for hundreds of thousands of people without feeling nervous, but the prospect of sitting next to the Queen of England for an entire opera performance filled him with anxiety that he couldn't quite articulate. This wasn't about his music or his performance. This was about being evaluated as a person, being judged by someone whose opinion genuinely mattered to him. Freddie had grown up in a Parsi household where respect for authority and tradition had been fundamental values. His father Bomi had taught him that your behavior reflected not just on yourself, but on your entire family and community. Despite his rebellious stage persona, despite the leather and the theatricality and the deliberate provocation of social norms, Freddie Mercury had never lost that core belief in showing proper respect to those who deserved it. And Queen Elizabeth II, in Freddie's mind, deserved respect. She represented something that went beyond politics or power. She represented dignity, duty, and the kind of grace under pressure that Freddie himself tried to embody in his performances. The idea that she wanted to meet him, that she had seen something in his work worth acknowledging, meant more to him than any platinum record or sold-out stadium. On the evening of November 18th, Freddie had dressed with more care than he had ever taken for any concert performance. The midnight black tuxedo had been custom-made by the same Savile Row tailor who dressed members of the royal family. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His hair, usually deliberately wild and theatrical, had been carefully styled in a conservative manner that would be appropriate for the formal setting. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. This wasn't Freddie Mercury, the rock star. This was Farrokh Bulsara, trying to honor his family's values and show the proper respect. The single white rose he carried had been chosen with equal care. White for purity and respect, long-stemmed and perfect, without a single blemished petal. It was a gift he intended to leave in the royal box, not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the honor he had been given. Freddie had arrived at the Royal Opera House precisely 15 minutes after the Queen, as palace protocol required. Nobody arrives before the monarch, but arriving too long after her entrance would be equally inappropriate. The timing had to be perfect. And Freddie had circled the block in his Mercedes 3 times to ensure he entered at exactly the right moment. When he stepped into the royal box, the entire theater had seemed to hold its breath. Queen Elizabeth II turned slightly in her seat, and for the first time, Freddie Mercury and the Queen of England made eye contact. What passed between them in that moment was difficult to describe. It wasn't the meeting of fan and celebrity. It wasn't the meeting of subject and sovereign. It was something closer to the mutual recognition of two people who understood what it meant to perform for audiences that expected perfection. The Queen nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Freddie bowed from the waist, not the exaggerated theatrical bow he used on stage, but a genuine, respectful bow that came from his upbringing. Then he took his seat beside her, and the performance began. What the audience below couldn't see, what the newspapers would never report, was the extraordinary conversation that took place in that royal box over the next 3 hours. It wasn't conducted in words. It was conducted in shared glances, in the subtle reactions to particularly beautiful musical passages, in the way both of them leaned forward slightly during the most dramatic areas. Freddie watched the opera with the focus of someone who understood what he was witnessing. This wasn't entertainment for him. This was a masterclass in vocal technique, in storytelling through music, in the discipline required to make something impossibly difficult appear effortless. He noticed when the soprano adjusted her breathing mid-phrase. He recognized when the tenor modified his vibrato to better project over the orchestra. He appreciated the choices the conductor made in tempo and dynamics. Queen Elizabeth II noticed that Freddie noticed these things. She saw him mouth along with certain phrases in Italian, revealing that he knew the libretto. She caught him wincing slightly when one of the supporting singers went slightly flat during a difficult passage. She recognized that the man sitting beside her wasn't a rock star pretending to appreciate opera. He was a genuine student of vocal music who understood the art form at a sophisticated level. During the intermission, the Queen did something that shocked her security detail. She requested that she and Freddie be left alone in the royal box for 10 minutes. No attendants, no staff, no witnesses, just the two of them, discussing what they had heard in the first half of the performance. Nobody knows exactly what was said during those 10 minutes. Both participants took the conversation to their graves, but people who were waiting outside the box reported hearing laughter, genuine laughter from both voices, mixing with serious discussion about vocal technique and musical interpretation. When the second half of the performance began, something had shifted in the royal box. The formal distance had softened into something approaching collegial respect. They were no longer monarch and subject. They were two people who loved music, appreciating a performance together. The moment that would be whispered about in royal circles for decades came after the final aria ended. In the hush between the last note and the inevitable explosion of applause, Queen Elizabeth II did something that had never been recorded in the history of British royal protocol. She stood up from her seat, not to acknowledge the performers on stage, but to turn toward Freddie Mercury. And she began to applaud him. Not for his fame, not for his music, but for the respect he had shown to an art form that she loved, for understanding that opera wasn't just entertainment, but the highest expression of human vocal capability, for sitting beside her with genuine appreciation, rather than bored celebrity tolerance. The entire Royal Opera House saw it happen. 2,000 people witnessed the Queen of England breaking centuries of protocol to acknowledge a rock star's understanding of classical music. The applause that followed was unlike anything that theater had ever heard. It wasn't just appreciation for the performance they had watched. It was recognition that they had witnessed something historic, something that transcended music and royalty and social class. When the Queen prepared to leave the royal box, Freddie stood and bowed again. But he didn't follow her out immediately. He waited until she had passed through the heavy oak doors, until the security detail had swept her toward the waiting cars. Then he turned back to the empty box and walked to the chair where the Queen had been sitting. He placed the single white rose carefully on the burgundy velvet cushion, laying it diagonally across the seat like a blessing. It was a gesture that nobody except the late arriving palace staff would see. No photographers captured it. No journalists reported it. It was purely for her, a private thank you from one performer to another. What Freddie didn't know was that the Queen's lady-in-waiting who entered the box to collect her forgotten program a few minutes later, saw the rose. Following protocol, she moved to remove it and dispose of it properly. But before she could pick it up, a quiet voice stopped her arm. "Leave it, please." Queen Elizabeth II had returned to the box entrance, having sent her security detail ahead. She walked to the chair, picked up the white rose herself, and held it for a moment, inhaling its scent. Then she looked at her lady-in-waiting and said something that the woman would repeat in a private interview 40 years later. "This rose represents something important. It represents respect given freely, not demanded by protocol. It represents the understanding that art transcends class and circumstance. I will keep this, and I will remember the young man who understood that we were equals tonight, at least in our appreciation of something beautiful." The Queen took the rose back to Buckingham Palace. According to palace staff who served during that period, she pressed it between the pages of her private diary in the entry for November 18, 1985. When she passed away in 2022 and her personal effects were cataloged, that pressed white rose was still there, alongside a handwritten note that read simply, "From the other king, a night of shared grace." The story of that evening remained largely unknown for decades. The official record showed only that Freddie Mercury had attended a royal gala as a guest. But in 2020, when the palace released selected portions of Queen Elizabeth II's private diaries for historical documentation, the entry for November 18, 1985 was included. "Tonight I met someone quite remarkable," she had written in her precise handwriting. "The world sees him as a rebel and provocateur, but I saw a young man who understands that great art requires discipline, respect, and the courage to be vulnerable in front of others. We spoke about music, about performance, about the loneliness that comes with standing in front of audiences who expect you to be perfect. He understands these things in ways that few people in my life have understood them. I hope history remembers him not just for his fame, but for his genuine artistry and his capacity for grace when the world wasn't watching." That November night proved something that transcended royalty and rock music. It proved that true nobility has nothing to do with titles or birth. It comes from the respect you show to others, from the grace you demonstrate when nobody is requiring you to demonstrate it, from the understanding that art and beauty belong to everyone, regardless of whether they wear a crown or carry a microphone. Two queens shared a box at the Royal Opera House on November 18, 1985. One wore actual jewels, the other wore a tuxedo and carried a white rose. And for 3 hours, they reminded everyone watching that greatness recognizes greatness, regardless of the form it takes.